welcome to day 4 of Moth Eaten Real's 31 Days of Horror 2024. Apologies for the lack of eroticism in yesterday's promised video. Luckily, today apparently accidentally made up for that with Candyman 1992. Let's talk about it. Candyman can cause he mixes up the light, makes the world taste good. Start with a mysterious swarm of bees that I really like visually. It fades into the smoke being blown on this woman's face, so we know we're in the 90s because we're smoking indoors. She is recording an interview from someone who is telling her a story about a babysitter who summoned Candyman by calling his name in the mirror 5 times. Turns out this woman with the smoke is a university graduate who is doing a thesis on urban legends and folklore with her colleague and friend Bernadette. We meet her husband Trevor, who lectures at the university and spurs her on to really go hard on this thesis because he's made it clear that he thinks the urban legends angle is just not very legitimate. But she and Bernadette then go to this estate, Cabrini Green, so they can get some real evidence on the things that they're finding out through interviews and hearsay and the oral tradition. Cabrini Green, interestingly, is a real estate in real life, mostly demolished now from what I found out, but they very much find the evidence they were after when they find an almost portal behind a mirror that leads into tight corridors and a big squeeze with lots of graffiti. There's this really iconic scene of when she crawls through various holes. The one that she comes out of, as an audience member, you can see that she's crawling out of the mouth of this mural of Candyman. This is obviously fantastic for her photos, and so she crawls back through the hole to Bernadette to say, I need more film. But they're stopped by a resident of the estate, Anne-Marie, who has great scary dog privilege, and they manage to wrangle an interview with her to talk about what she knows about Candyman and the estate. She invites them into her room, and she has a little baby with her scary dog as well. And with this new vigor they have for their thesis, Bernadette and Helen go back to her home, and Helen says, oh, it's still nonsense though, isn't it? And so they go to the mirror and jokingly, gigglingly say Candyman 5 times. Bernadette doesn't. She stops on the 4th. Helen says, you chicken. Then we get a little jump scare from drunken Trevor as he comes in at 3 a.m. But the important thing here is Helen has said Candyman 5 times. Horror ensues as Candyman appears, putting Helen under some kind of hypnosis where she doesn't recall what happens when she wakes up with a knife to the head of a decapitated dog and a missing baby. Anne-Marie's missing baby. What follows is a psychological mystery as Helen tries to get the baby back and clear her name for the police. Now, I haven't read The Forbidden, which is the Clive Barker story this movie is based on, but for this, I did then go and look into some little trivia bits and bobs. And interestingly, the story is originally placed in Liverpool, Clive Barker's hometown. The director and he had this brainwave to then set it in Chicago, Illinois. Whereas in Liverpool, most of the focus was on class. Once transported to Chicago, the focus turns to race. I love the power horror has to address social issues in a way that actually lets you explore things that people, if in a documentary, would often then censor. In this case, I think the film does a great job at opening the possibility of engaging with the real history of America, with genocide and slavery. I'm not going to go too deeply into it, but obviously it would be unhinged for me to not address these topics whilst discussing Candyman. As director Bernard Rose says, in American society, the class barriers were drawn along racial lines, especially in places like Chicago. Helen and Trevor really do stand out with some other academics that they engage with early on, and it's something that does prop up that commentary on class and race when, as I say, it's in the university where we then see most of the white characters. Early on when Bernadette and Helen approach a dinner party with their thesis, and with a lot of confidence, Helen's like, we're gonna bury you, one of the academics. He is obnoxious, he's very condescending, patronizing, turns around and says, how are you going to do that when I've already covered this story 10 years ago? It's where we get the cheeky bit of exposition about Candyman before he was Candyman in his human life. When he was a man named Daniel and the tragedy of his murder and how that fed into the Candyman legend. They say that he was brutalized, his hand chopped off, and he was near an apiary, and so they covered him in honey, and the bees stung him to death. And this is all delivered in a very detached way that, as I say again, it's got a mockery to it, because he's mostly just flexing that he's already done this story these two women are doing. I think this dinner with fellow academics also brings in a great visual contrast, that kind of ivory tower vibe of their nice, well-paid-for dinner and attire, in contrast to the real impactful scenes of the film, which take place in Cabrini Green. As I mentioned early on, when Helen is first exploring the building, she finds herself walking through holes in the walls, and one of those holes is then the mouth of a mural of Candyman. I think this is really beautiful visually and an iconic shot, but also I think that it carries forward a metaphor for the conclusion of the film. If you're here again, I will assume that you will never watch this film or have watched this film, so I will tell you now that the conclusion of the film, Helen dies. Helen and Candyman are in a big bonfire as she saves the baby. She crawls out, she hands the baby to his mother, and she dies from her burn wounds. We see her funeral, Trevor is there, fucking Trevor, and as she's lowered down, all the residents from Cabrini Green come to pay their respects. Jake, a central character from Cabrini Green, drops in Candyman's hook as he is burned to death in the bonfire, and then at home, Trevor says Helen's name 5 times in the mirror and she appears and kills him. I think, though, when I was talking about the visual metaphor of her walking out of Candyman's mouth with the mural, that it's also something that I look back on now and think, oh, it's like, because she is also still being talked about. There's then a lot of commentary on urban myth and legend and the power of being believed. One of the quotes from Candyman early on at their first meeting is something along the lines of how she has actually managed to weaken his power by putting him in a position where he is not believed as much, because she's rationalizing it with her thesis. And so when she approaches Trevor at this end part, she's only able to do that because he is afraid of her. That's where the power comes from. And I will say, as a criticism, I do think it's unfortunate that one of the director's intentions that I don't think it did come through very well was trying to kind of bring up this idea that basically a lot of deprived neighborhoods that people are just scared to walk through just because of people who live there. The idea that it's just an irrational belief that causes that fear of that danger. Again, it's something in the original text about Liverpool. Clive Barker mentioned specifically that his grandmother, when he was a child, always warned him against going in public toilets in the area. I think they use that environment really well, of the big brick walls and the twisting corridors where you can't quite see. It also reminds me, because I'm a gamer, of the fixed camera angles in older survival horror games, including that slightly irrational fear where even if you know you're in a safe space, you can't see around these corridor turnings, and going into that bathroom when the little boy Jake tells her that's where Candyman is. In reality, poor Jake has misled her because he is just a little boy and can't tell the difference between gangs who are taking the opportunity to take on the Candyman persona and the real Candyman. And so Helen is attacked in this place. They hold her down as he then lunges at her with his hook, going, "Heard you was looking for the Candyman, bitch." Because of this confusion, once out of the hospital and after the police line up, where they don't sing Ain't Nothing But a Heartbreak, but it was number 5, Helen talks to Jake and tries to explain to him that the Candyman isn't real. He's just a fairy tale like Dracula or Frankenstein. Now buckle up, because there's a lot to dive into there. So the first thing to get out of the way is the Dr. Frankenstein, because Frankenstein, it's Frankenstein's monster actually, and Dracula do then have a basis on real people, much like Candyman. But the second thing is that these are also 2 iconic Gothic heroes who are villains, but they are also a tragic villain. They're both in the position of actually being very well spoken, well read, sophisticated, regal in Dracula's case especially. But this is the awkward thing about Frankenstein, where we have to do a crash course every time, because you know what, that old film was really good in a lot of ways, but it has built up this mythos of Frankenstein as actually just a big kind of apish grunting. It's not accurate. Frankenstein's monster is actually, as I say, well-spoken, well-read, comes out with some really philosophical lines all the time. They both have this kind of tragedy around them where the isolation and the terror that they have arguably undeservedly inspired make them quite romantic, tragic villains, much like Candyman. And drawing these parallels in this way also allows for a different kind of perspective going into future interactions with Candyman. To a modern audience, obviously a gothic castle is just not inspiring that same real terror and dread. Not like something that people to this day feel when they walk through the wrong kind of neighbourhood. We see early on when Bernadette and Helen drive into Cabrini Green that Bernadette has brought an arsenal. I wasn't even sure what some of those things were, but I think it was tasers and a pepper spray can. Really then highlights the perceived threat of the estate. Helen, on the other hand, she is very much not believing that there is a threat to her and Bernadette there, despite Bernadette then being in a position where she really is trying to warn Helen that yes, there is some threat. Why have you had us dress like cops? Helen claims that that was not her intent. She simply said that they should dress conservatively. But this definitely does create almost a shield around them when they do enter the estate, and the first lads that they see are then convinced that they are the cops. And so it just bolsters Helen on when they go upstairs, and she says, oh, they're just going to ignore us. They think that we're cops. Nobody prepared me. This film is then actually criminally underrated because, again, Dracula, not so much Frankenstein, he's not only then this tragic villain, but then is also kind of a sex symbol in some ways, you know. Tony Todd also embodies this Phantom of the Opera type thing as well for actually being darkly seductive. Silly bit of trivia from me. I actually thought Helen's name was Ellen until he said her name because, oh, he pronounced the H. It was sonorous, it was beautiful, it was seductive. Another great bit of trivia, Tony Todd and Virginia Madsen, who plays Helen, actually were requested to have waltzing lessons together and fencing lessons together in preparation for the chemistry of this role. I think one of my kind of preconceptions was knowing that this was a film from 1992, a time where a lot of black comedy that came before it was extremely campy and very like cartoonish. Those notions did come into my preconceptions going into this movie of what Candyman would be like. I think even just Candyman is then an interesting kind of name. In reality, that is obviously something that comes with that nice juxtaposition, you know? The idea of like blood and honey type, sweet and gore. When she first goes into the lair, coming out of the mouth, again, that scene, she actually finds a bunch of sweetie wrappers, which have little razor blades in them, so that, I think, is obviously another just sharp image to get that across, that relationship between the terror and the treats. I had heard before as well that some people think that Candyman is also a Cenobite in the Clive Barker mythos, so I think that then that also maybe supports that idea that there is that relationship between pain and pleasure. Yes, he has such a noble, suave, majestic aura around him. I'm pretty sure he's done Shakespeare plays. I think another thing that popped out in the Shakespeare line of things was that one of the bits of graffiti along the walls as she's exploring Cabrini Green, "Sweets to the sweet," which is a line from Hamlet. The context in Hamlet, aren't you glad you have a literature student here who obviously knows every Shakespeare play ever? The context in Hamlet is actually that it's a line that is said by Ophelia's mother at Ophelia's funeral. The sweets that she presents to the sweet are her funeral flowers. So again, we have this other example within the movie's media and its intertextuality of mixing the macabre with then, as I say, things that have this sweet association. Speaking of, shout out to Mikey. Bet you thought you'd never get a flippin' cameo in these videos for once upon a time telling me a Bible story about how Lyle's Golden Syrup has a lion on the front that has bees coming out of it. An image that's going to stay with you forever every time you look at a Golden Syrup can. And of course, bees are Candyman's thing. I just love this elegance and the way that it's used for Candyman to actually, as I say, ultimately make him a very romantic villain. There's a scene near the end where he picks up Helen in this bridal style, and it is within this other piece of delicious set design. I think that they did a really fantastic job, not only with those twisting corridors, but also in the way that within Candyman's lair, first of all, the way that she has to crawl up through there into from something that looks a little bit like a hive. It has then these drippy bits of plaster coming off the walls, again with this kind of like reddish lighting, like graffiti, and the way that some of the other building materials are ragged around the edges, like peeling flesh, but also, again, like a beehive. But she crawls up through there into this corridor that has then the recorded history of Daniel, the Candyman, when he was mortal, through lots of different bits of graffiti and murals that are really well detailed and remind you, or reminded me at least, as she was going through, of a bunch of kind of like Michelangelo cathedral ceilings and walls. And going back to that cathedral church imagery, we then enter the area where Candyman is sleeping like a vampire. I think he even has the hook in this shape. I may be misremembering though because of the fact that the image was so vampiric. And she stakes him. It obviously doesn't work, but I'm telling you why the associations were there. And there are candles, and the way that the graffiti is actually very intricate. It's lots of layered graffiti, one over the other, much like how oral tradition and folk tales told orally and communicated urban legend-wise will have little details changed every time. Oof, love this movie. And another fantastic thing that this layered graffiti does visually is when it's done over the windows, it creates that stained glass effect. Another aspect that really, really gorgeously brings it into the Gothic tradition is the way that the soundtrack is done in a way where it's actually it's very basic, it's simple and clean. It's organ, piano, and choir. So keeping it so clean like that really then means that the tension is not then being told to you through music. I think it's something that the director has said, is that I love him because same. I hate when I'm watching a horror movie and the music is telling me to be scared. I hate when I'm watching any movie and the music is telling me to feel some kind of way, especially when I'm watching a scene where I would not feel that kind of way if you replace the music. And not in that comical Spider-Man 3 way, you know the one, but in that way where really it is just going Blagar, and I'm like, but it's not Blagar, is it? Having this choir be just like an ominous humming. It's quite faded. There's no lyrics exactly. It's more tonal, much like the buzzing of bees. And the piano is played in these moments where, again, it's very romantic, it's sensual, it has that eroticism to it. And the organ, the kind of corruption it implies, the idea that something that you mostly associate with churches would be played somewhere more private, that kind of spitting in the face of God. Why is the organ out of God's house? But mostly the fact that it's an organ obviously can sound very majestic and penetrating. One thing I feel like I do have to address about the romance, because it was something that was apparently on the filmmaker's mind and good, As I said earlier, the thing about horror is that it's a great gateway to be able to discuss things that already make people feel uncomfortable, but once you've stuck the horror genre in front of it, it then becomes, in a way, in a twisted way, more palatable because people go into it knowing that they're meant to be horrified. Or furthermore, depending on how the horror plays it out, they could turn around and then think that it's quite comic booky and therefore not that serious. But one thing about the romance-tinged scenes between Helen and Candyman is that it does draw off of this old trope. I'm sure it has a name, but I do not know it. Of then the idea that then a black male would go after a white female in a way that is lustful and impure. And so that's something that the filmmakers were aware of portraying in the way that it wouldn't then look like they were then replicating these ideas. And obviously I'm not an authority on this, it's why it's a little bit difficult for me to talk about. I'm some facts that may surprise you and some that may not. I'm not black, I'm not American, I'm not from a city, and I wasn't really alive during the 90s, so there's a lot of things here that I inevitably have opinions on, but cannot really comment on with any kind of concrete authority. But I really think that then it does then help that there was an awareness of class because of Clive Barker's original story, The Forbidden, which Candyman was based on, where then having this actor Tony Todd portray Candyman with then the full authority of like a Shakespearean tone, that elegance again, that majesty, that regal way of being defined, and his presence. I think that was then a better way for it to say a message that would hopefully not then be associated with this old racist trope. So back to the Hamlet quote, sweets for the sweet. As I mentioned in the original context, it is to do with throwing down funeral flowers. And so because Helen's hair is entirely scorched off as she's rescuing the baby from the bonfire, then her head is wreathed in flowers. So again, I thought that was like a cool intertextual callback. But also, I love that we got to then see her in her casket, ready for later, when she's called upon through the mirror by Trevor. Fucking Trevor! Okay, so, sorry, I keep promising that we'll talk about Trevor. Let's talk about Trevor! So I'll be honest, this never sounds honest. It's always like a, I knew it, and you didn't. But early on, I got some sick vibes from him. His first scene where he's talking to Helen and kind of talking down to her about her thesis and how he doesn't really believe it, because he's coming off the back of teaching a lecture to these kids about how urban legends are nonsense. And it's always something that is just reflecting the fears of the time, which is true. However, again, I don't like the way he patronises her, and I don't like the way that he mentions how adolescents have raging hormones and that they fancy him. When she is first incarcerated for beheading Anne-Marie's dog, she does then try and call him when she's at the police station. And we see then a picture of their marriage next to the phone, next to the bed, which is empty. That's when I knew. I thought, why would they show a picture of their wedding and the fact that the bed is flipping empty? It is revealed to us that he has been sleeping with a student the second time that Helen is incarcerated and escapes in this really brutal, fun scene that I thought was going to be a fake out. Sorry, we need to talk about this. An aside. So, after the thing that I didn't want to mention, which is that Candyman hypnotizes Helen into killing Bernadette. Bernadette comes to her door with flowers, roses, and baby's breath, and I shipped them so hard, man. But Helen is hypnotized, wakes up to find that she has killed her friend and has been incarcerated and has been taken to a mental institution, and at some point then she is brought out after being told, you've been under for at least a month because we thought that was safest. She's strapped to a bed, Candyman visits her, pleading with her for just one exquisite kiss, but nah, not after the coming down and then hiding under the bed. The movement didn't vibe with me. But then, when she is confronted with the person who is meant to be kind of diagnosing her, helping her with her case, says, no, Candyman is real, I'll prove it to you. And there's a mirror next to her, and so she says Candyman 5 times. And it feels like a fake out. It feels like he's not gonna come in this scenario, and so she's just gonna look even more balmy in front of this guy that's meant to be diagnosing if she's fit for public. So there is that pause, and then Candyman comes and just in a very slow, agonizing way gets his hook up this guy's spine and just rips slowly. Like, if you've ever actually ripped fabric, that's what the movement was like. It was so nice. Yes, yum yum body horror. Yum yum slasher kills. He removes the straps that are tying Helen to the chair, and then she escapes, jumps out the window, and then steals someone's scrubs after scaring them to death. And it really goes to show that if you walk with confidence in uniform somewhere, you can get away with anything. She arrives home to Trevor, but not to Trevor actually. She comes into her home and sees that everything is wrapped up in plastic. Some of these things look brand new, and that the wall is pink and it looks like it's being stripped, ready maybe for someone new to move in. It sure is. She turns to the side, and who does she see but this student from the university with a roller painting all of the walls bright baby pink. And it is all revealed that Trevor, the fucking cock, the creep, the nonce, sorry, I know it technically doesn't count when it's university, but come on. He's been sleeping with this student the whole time, and that's why he wasn't there that night. And God, he's the true villain. Here's the true villain. She also holds the phone out to them both like, go on, call someone. And she has this maniacal little smirk. And I think it's when he first comes into the room and sees her that she says, what's the matter, Trevor? Scared of something? I love the repetition at the end of the movie when he calls her out from the mirror and she's in her funeral garb, sans flower crown, and she's got her burned white scalp and her darkened lips, and the whole thing is just then very traditional ghost looking. And she repeats the line again, what's the matter, Trevor? Scared of something? This movie is so close to being a good for her movie, but poor Bernadette. I think that there is so much to talk about here, but trying to just word vomit it all out right now doesn't let me go in as deeply as I would like to. So I'm going to wrap it up here and say that Candyman 1992 is 4.5 swarms of well-cared-for bees. Yes, everyone on set was stung by the bees at least once, but they were very well cared for. See, I love practical effects, but the dangers. Tomorrow's film will also be from 1992, a German psychological horror. I'll see you tomorrow for some subtitles appreciation.